Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for Luna Abyss. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to get into it, for the movement we have about a 28.7% axial dead zone, and that creates a central square of no movement. Axial dead zones apply to the entirety of each axis, so if your stick is anywhere within these dead zones, represented by these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of four directions. So in this case, perfectly forward, perfectly backward, perfectly to the right, and perfectly to the left. You only start seeing diagonal movement occur when you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And if we use this light post as a gauge, you can see that as long as I'm within this axial dead zone, I'm aligned with it. But when I break out of this, I drift to the right a bit, and I'm drifting to the left. For the movement speeds, the curve is linear, but you can see that it starts faster. It doesn't meet at the dead zone. And that's actually because this is an Unreal Engine game, and Unreal seems to default to 25% axial dead zones. And the difference in the dead zones, they've added a small additional axial dead zone on top of that, but one that the input is not scaled around, so it's actually cropping off the lowest possible values. So you're actually losing those small values, but otherwise the movement speed increases granularly until you're full speed. This does apply to the angles as well. These additional axial dead zones are cropping off your most subtle angles, but that'll be more obvious when we get to the camera. Otherwise, this shaded region represents the sprint threshold. So basically any forward movement you make, you can start sprinting. But you can see that this threshold begins within the movement dead zone, and it's actually tied to that underlying 25% engine dead zone. So you can start sprinting, but since you're not above the actual dead zone, you're not actually moving. But once you do break out of the dead zone, you have the same curve of movement. So that initial part is cropped, but otherwise the sprinting is basically a modifier for your general movement. So you have the same curve that you have with normal movement. And sprinting will disable when you fall beneath this threshold. And you actually can't disable it by pressing the stick again. You have to either fall outside the threshold or within the central dead zone far enough. But sprinting is about 50% faster than your normal movement speed, and crouching is about half the speed of your normal movement speed. For the camera, we have a 27.2% axial dead zone, so just a hair smaller than the movement. And again, since it's axial, it restricts diagonal movement around the axes. So I can bob around this vertical axis and point at very obvious angles, but as long as I'm within this axial dead zone, I'm moving perfectly horizontally. This is until I break out of both axis dead zones, where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. And diagonal movement occurring is a little more noticeable than usual because, the same as with movement, that difference in the underlying 25% axial dead zone and a tiny axial dead zone that the dev is adding is cropping the smallest diagonals, so they're just a little more noticeable than normal. But in either case, it's most noticeable when capping the view like this and looking for horizontal movement. And you can see that threshold very clearly. The curve is linear, same as with movement. However, it's being cropped, but slightly less just because of the slight difference in size between the camera and movement dead zone. Otherwise, it increases linearly to full stick tilt. The curve is likely set up per axis rather than per magnitude, meaning that the curve is applied separately for the horizontal and vertical axes and using the distance from each of those rather than per magnitude from the center. That actually doesn't matter when using linear curves because linear curves function the same between both implementations. However, you can see that my stick can lean outside of this circular graph, and that would be over 100% magnitude. However, with axial dead zones, the diagonal thresholds are pushed outward, so the exact threshold may be a little different. But if your stick was able to move to the full corner of the analog module, the diagonal sensitivity is not capped in this game. So if your stick could move to those full corners, you'd be able to move diagonally at your perfect diagonals up to about 40% faster than your cardinal left and right, up and down sensitivities. Most players' sticks can't lean that far, so this probably won't be noticeable for some players, but it isn't ideal for the diagonal magnitudes to not be capped. As far as the vertical and horizontal sensitivities, they're the same. There's only one sensitivity slider, so that's useful that they're the same. But overall, these issues can make general camera movements feel difficult. A larger dead zone makes making precise adjustments more difficult. This cropped implementation makes those smallest values simply inaccessible, and the axial dead zone makes it so your angular movements aren't accurate. And in many games that need some accuracy, these are significant issues. However, this game specifically recommends using a very hard lock target aim assist. So in this case, using the left trigger. And when you're locked on, you are hard locked, so you don't need to focus on aiming at all. But it also has an option for aim assist, and this functionally does the same thing, but the strength does allow it to fall off. So this is at 50%, and you can actually see that it's hard locked, but if it gets far enough, it can snap off of it. And if it's at 100, it will stay locked on perfectly, just as this hard lock. This option, aim assist, doesn't seem as ideal. One, because it's not quite as strong if you're going to use aim assist, but more so because if you want to target specific enemies, your crosshair can get snagged on any variety of enemies, and there's only one here, but there's quite a bit more during normal gameplay, and it just becomes a pit of snagging. Whereas with the lock-on, you directly can choose the target you want, and you simply flick the stick to cycle between enemies. So this game doesn't require precision, but it would of course be nice if the controls were better if you wanted to free aim, because free aiming by itself is quite unpleasant. But the last Deadzone to cover in this game is the Deadzone for the radial wheel. And you can see here that this is a rounded square shape, and the shape is caused by having the underlying 25% axial deadzone being present, and then setting up a radial deadzone on top of it that creates this rounded square shape. So it would be normally a central square, but the radial deadzone is being built on top of that, creating the shape. Otherwise, these thresholds are completely unaffected, simply because there's 4 weapons and the dividing line would be these perfect angles. Having underlying axial deadzones would affect differently shaped wheels, but just having 4 directions has this completely skirt that. The biggest credit I can give to this wheel is that it's instantly responsive and there's no delay when switching between selections. So this is an extremely responsive wheel and allows you to instantly swap between all your weapons, and that's really wonderful. There's a very unfortunate trend in many games of trying to overload the wheel, where tapping the button switches to your previous weapon, and you have to hold to get the wheel, and that creates a delay on switching to the wheel, which makes wheels quite a bit less efficient. But here you can switch instantly, so you have your weapons all at instant access. One thing which isn't an inherent problem with this wheel, but more depends entirely on the controller you're using, is the Deadzone size is pretty large, but for a wheel it's kind of modest, and this stick can snap back, and you can see that I'm moving it just perfectly to the right, but it's snapping back far enough that it's actually selecting the leftwards position. And this does happen quite regularly when I'm playing. I might want a specific gun, but get the exact opposite direction. So I have to be a little more careful with my selections. I've recommended larger axial deadzones. Or no, I'm not axial deadzones. Larger wheel deadzones. One, because it increases the arc range for the selection regions. With 4 directions, that's not an issue at all. You know, this is massive. But having a larger arc range means that it's more reliable to accurately select a weapon and not accidentally bleed into the adjacent selection. But having a larger wheel deadzone also would avoid the snapback issues. If, say, the deadzone was 80% or further, this wouldn't really happen. And because when you're using a wheel, you're going to be pushing the stick fully, the deadzone size really doesn't matter, so you can set it high and both make it easier to select the weapon you want, as well as to avoid snapback. But again, I'm not going to hold this against the game specifically, just because this is a specific controller issue. Some controllers have no issue with this, other controllers have more significant issues with it. But having larger wheel deadzones could accommodate that entirely. But again, I do want to really highlight that this wheel is instant, because games, I'm going to throw Doom Eternal under the bus. force a lot of delay on the radial wheel, and that heavily limits the effectiveness of radial wheels. So having this be as responsive as it is definitely a highlight. But that about covers things. This game is relatively new. However, unfortunately, the dev team seems to have been let go very shortly after the game came out. So improvements to this game, while otherwise could be possible, don't seem to be likely now. Of course, it would be nice if these dead zones were radial, the unscaled additional dead zones being removed, and curve options being added, dead zone and curve options being added, would greatly improve the quality of controls in this game. But of course, with this hard aim assist, you really don't need precision when fighting. It would just be a nice quality of life for general navigation, and if you wanted to fight without using aim assist. But that's enough rambling from me. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.